In this dialogue, I speak with Bruce Sanguin, a fellow evolutionary pioneer and also a Christian mystic. We speak about the realm of evolutionary spirituality and the phenomena of intersubjective awakening. And along the way, we discover that both of us have become fascinated by the wisdom of indigenous cultures. I think you'll enjoy the synergy of our interchange very much.
I think the synergy between the ideas that are in the book and the things that I talk about and the ways that I think and the ways that you think and what you're thinking about, I think the synergy between that will be helpful to people. It'll probably illuminate some of the ideas in the book and bring things out with more richness just because we're having a dialogue about it. And so that was why I invited you to be part of this series, and I'm very happy that you accepted the invitation.
Well, thanks, Jeff. It's an honor.
And great. And I guess I just thought to start by asking you if there was anything particular about the book that that maybe you found particularly interesting and enticing that might serve as just the launch pad for this conversation.
I love the idea of a couple different ideas, but I'll start with, first of all, I want to say that I love the book, and I find that the way the progression of the book, how you lay down sort of foundations for the next chapter and build upon it, it's pretty effective in terms of a reader touching into the space, and in terms of kind of an extended pointing out session in the form of a book. So, yeah, well done, first of all.
Thank you.
I like the way you've put it together. And of course, I've long been interested. Some of my own mystical experiences have taken me into some of the places that you describe. And this kind of question of identity, which is your book's kind of an extended reflection on. And my own experience is that or discovery or eye-opening that I am, we are sort of the localized expression or manifestation of a more fundamental and pervasive consciousness having a human experience and actually perceiving in a way on behalf of whatever that mystery is that's living us is a very real thing for me. And when you describe, I can't remember whose phrase it is, but talking about it as platforms of perception.
Right. That was Jeffrey Eisen, a spiritual teacher that and friend of mine. That's his concept. The self is a platform for perception.
Right. I found that to be a helpful metaphor, and just the whole the way in which you tease out the distinction between the me, the objectified sense of myself, and the I, and then move into, in the final chapter, the sense that it's in the intersubjective space that a new experience of the I can emerge. I just think that's really powerful, and given that it's based in your own experience, I find it compelling.
Well, that's great, and it gives me a couple of places that I'd like to start with, and the first is exactly what you started with, because I think by and large, the picture of consciousness and of the universe and of evolution that we in the West have adopted is one where the universe is essentially seen as devoid of consciousness, and so through the process of evolution, first there's nothing, and then there's a big bang, and that generates all of the particles and energy, and then the particles and energy do a dance over trillions of years and form planets and suns, and then on at least one of those planets, living matter forms, and eventually at least one species develops a capacity for consciousness, and it's so there's an idea that at some moment consciousness appears in the universe, and it wasn't there before, and so if that is the case, then that means that consciousness is limited to a species, maybe a few species. It also tends to make us believe that our consciousness is somehow embedded in us. It's located inside of us. And what you said earlier, and what is the premise of the book, is that actually the universe itself is conscious from the start. Mm-hmm. And that what we experience as our particularly human variation of consciousness is an aspect of the universal consciousness that is there that's there from the start, that exists in everything, always.
Yeah, thanks. And this to kind of drop into that awareness is a profound shift in identity from a kind of very small and contracted self. And often when people look out at the universe and all the stars, the trillions of stars, etc., I often get in my workshops, so we're so insignificant. But I try to say, well, it's this. Ken Wilber talks about the confusion between span and significance. Just because we're physically small doesn't mean that we're not significant, and our significant might just lie in the idea and the actual reality that we're like concentrated amalgams of that intelligence that's there from the get-go, and that we're the localized manifestation of all of that having a human experience. And therefore our, as I was saying before, a platform of perception, the universe is experiencing itself. And we can go on and, in this conversation to talk about, the qualitative experience of what that consciousness is that is living us and that we can awaken to and have experiences on behalf of, if you like. But just this shift into a much expanded, a universal self, or a cosmic self, if you like, is a profound shift in identity from what you called, the thinking thing consciousness. And
which is sort of it's the sense of self that we're so wedded to at the moment, that we are a thing that exists in a universe of other things.
Right.
And, we have the special quality of being able to think. And so thinking, the ability to think, becomes a characteristic of the thing that we are.
Right.
So we, if you think about the way that we chop up the world, we have all of these seemingly separate things, and they all have different characteristics, and we are a thing. And we have a very special characteristic, which is that we think. But as you said, it keeps us embedded in a very small sense of who we are.
Yeah, in an isolated,
absolutely
holistic sense of who we are in a world of other things that then we have to work at connecting with.
That's right.
as opposed to being in a milieu of interconnectedness that is just the nature of reality itself.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think this is, it becomes logically the assumption of separation that undergirders so much of our experience of reality and our experience of ourselves becomes indefensible pretty quickly if you start to look at it. So one of the thought exercises that I employ, to help people's thinking is to say, one of our most basic assumptions about ourselves, an assumption so deeply assumed and so unconscious that we generally don't question it, is that we appeared in the universe at some specific time, that there was a time when we didn't exist, and then there was a time when we did exist. And so, I ask people to identify when is the moment that they appeared in the universe. What is the moment where you could say before that moment you were not here, but after that moment you were here? And of course, the moment of conception is a great candidate. But if you really start looking at the moment of conception, it gets pretty hard to say that you were definitively here once a sperm and an egg came together.
Right.
And so then you kind of look, maybe you jump to the actual moment of birth, but clearly it feels like that doesn't necessarily delineate, you were not here before the moment that you emerged from the womb, and then you were here. And pretty quickly you sort of realize there is no moment that feels definitive as an entry point, which means, if you extrapolate out, that you were always here.
Right.
That you were never not here.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And it usually when people think this through, it's one of those things that doesn't make sense because we, our way of thinking has been so conditioned by an assumption of separation, an assumption of limitation in terms of time, meaning that we had a definitive beginning and will have a definitive end.
Yeah. And I loved your section. I love that section too, which felt like a pointing out thing, and it really does that. It really dissolves the separate me very effectively, and then you taste into the I that is now going to experience itself in and through us. And also building on that, how the case you made for how our language doesn't describe reality. Our language is a commitment to a particular reality. It's not necessarily descriptive of a pre-existing reality, but rather our way of committing to a particular world coming into view, and or securing ourselves in a particular worldview, which is the one we're describing of the world of me as separate from you, as separate from the stars, as separate from the trees, and so we're really embedded, even in our language, in a profound commitment to that, what you call a super story of the separate me.
Right. There's a story about the human race being made up of isolated, independent individuals that all have a separate thinking capacity as one of their characteristics, that roam the earth, live on the earth, and interact together, sometimes harmoniously and sometimes unharmoniously. But that is the kind of super story that we live inside of without it ever really being called into question.
Yeah, beautiful. One of the things, Jeff, building on that I was intrigued about was your openness to entheogens and how this world that we're describing, consensus reality, if you like, of the realm of separation, looks at those entheogens, whether they're plant medicines or LSD or MDMA, and says, well, sure, you feel all connected and all one and all loving. You're on a drug. It's altering the mind, versus actually realizing that all the medicine is doing is opening your mind up to what's already there, but outside of our capacity to land in and experience.
Right.
And this is the realm. I've had some profound experiences on ayahuasca in the last, 6-7 months, which is a plant medicine from Amazon. And but in terms of this awareness that consciousness predates the emergence of the human being, I remember going outside during the ceremony and lying on my back and looking at the stars, and I was in this profound unitive consciousness, and suddenly I really got that the stars weren't simply inert balls of gas, devoid of meaning and purpose, but rather were directly participating energetically, actually, and in terms of a form of intelligence, a form of without which we could not actually continue on Earth. So our continuation as a species was directly connected to and being participated by these trillions of stars. And it was very clear that these were centers of consciousness to me.
That's beautiful.
And, there could be no doubt after this experience that of the intelligence and the energetic participation of what the ancients would have called the heavens in our life collectively. It was
right.
a profound experience of the oneness and the pervasiveness of this consciousness that is the source of the I.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, since you brought that up. I actually had an experience just last week, which really has stayed with me, and it's something I keep thinking about. And I think I want to write about it eventually, but I'm still letting it land. And it was a very simple moment. It wasn't any. I've had very dramatic experiences at times. This one wasn't particularly dramatic, but its implications were amazing. I was just outside, and I live on the East Coast. I live in the Northeast of the United States, and it happens to be unseasonably warm right now. And I was outside, so I was particularly appreciating a beautiful sunny day. And I happened to look up at the sun and sort of then back down at the earth and noticing how the sunlight was shining on the earth. And because the sunlight was shining on the earth, I could, everything was being illuminated in the beautiful colors of the sun. And for some reason, I had this flash of insight where I realized that the sun shining down on the earth and illuminating everything, making it possible for me to see, is a perfect metaphor for how I experience consciousness. As, a kind of illuminating force that seems to emanate from me and makes the world shine so that I can experience it, both the outer world but also the inner world. It illuminates my thoughts and feelings and makes them visible to me. And then I realized it was a perfect metaphor, and then I thought, it's actually not a metaphor.
Right.
It's the same thing.
Right.
The sun shining down and illuminating the earth, and my capacity or the capacity for conscious awareness extending out and illuminating the world are not, one is not a metaphor for the other, but somehow, in some way that I literally don't understand, they are the same thing. That the reason I'm experiencing consciousness the way I am is because of the way the sun illuminates the earth.
Yeah, it's beautiful. That's beautiful. I mean, to my ears, it feels kind of shamanic.
Right.
The sensibility that if what we're saying is true, then obviously this consciousness that is the milieu for all that arises is also animating the sun. And
right.
Something about sun consciousness, which is a reflection, a perfect kind of reflection of the light of consciousness that also animates us. And brings into view the world that we can see.
Absolutely. And like you said, it is very shamanic because it leaves you with a sense of, connection is a word that I find difficult because connection already sounds like something that's joining things that are separate. And
right.
This is more a sense of unity, of oneness, of the fact that's what that experience left me with, was a sense that, I'm not just a thing on this planet. I am this planet. I am this universe.
Right.
And my experience is somehow, it's everything that I experience as a seemingly separate individual human being is all the same patterning that's being displayed everywhere in the universe. There's just one dance of creation that's happening on all different levels, and I am that dance.
That's beautiful. Yeah, exactly. That's. I get that, and it made me wonder in reading your stuff too, Jeff, is to get curious about the distinctions between what you describe in your last chapter as the potential of the intersubjective space to give rise to the soul of a new self, and whether or not kind of a shamanic or an indigenous way of experiencing the world was precisely that they only experienced themselves in the context of relationality between the other humans, members of their tribe and family, but also between them and the river and the sun and the moon and the seasons and the wind. And they only knew themselves to even exist or have being in and through those relationships. They couldn't, in a sense, imagine themselves being as an isolated entity because they were so embedded in relationality.
Right.
And I just wondered about, this modernist period that we've come through in the last 300 years, and that has sort of landed us with this sense of separate existence and the illusion of separation, and constructed a whole society and all our institutions based on that super story.
Right.
Now, the question for me is has that been all a distraction? In what way has that 300, 400-year journey been necessary? Or did it simply divert us from an earlier consciousness? And I know this gets into a whole conversation about stages of development, etc., and the usefulness of that. But I'm curious about that, because in some ways, especially when you're on, these doing these sacred medicines, you're in this we space. You're in this intersubjective reality that it's not, as you say, that you feel like you over here have now connected with all that is. It's that, in a sense, there is no you over here to connect with that over there. You just see and experience the pre-given unity of all that is.
It's interesting as you bring this up, Bruce, because it sounds like you've been maybe more recently becoming interested in some, in the wisdom of indigenous peoples and shamanism, and in different ways I have as well. So is that true, first of all?
That's true, yes.
So the reason I'm finding this interesting is because, you and I are both proponents of evolutionary spirituality and have been for a long time. And in evolutionary spiritual circles, it's generally looked down upon to seek wisdom from more ancient cultures. Because, as you said, it's there's a whole conversation around the fact that evolution is progressive, and therefore, we can't look back at the past because we need to move forward. And I realize that there is a whole conversation, and there's more sophisticated and more simplistic ways in which people talk about that. But I guess, for myself, and maybe you and I are having a similar questioning. It feels to me like there is a storyline in which, through the period of the Enlightenment and then through the whole development of modernism, the Enlightenment was really one of its philosophical foundations was the power of objectification. So the ability to remove yourself from the scene, adopt an objective viewpoint that could be, seen as the same by other people who adopted the objective viewpoint. Was a big part of the basis of the rationality that was developed in the Enlightenment and became the foundation for science. But that objectification it is an effort of removing ourselves from embeddedness in nature. And there is a story that says, well, that process of disembedding ourselves from nature may be a big part of many of the environmental and global challenges that we face. And it may be something we need to overcome, not by going back to becoming, to the way of life of indigenous tribes, which would no longer work for us, but perhaps by rediscovering levels of connectedness to the world that we lost during the modern era.
Yeah. And Jeff, I've been reading a lot of Goethe and his scientific method, which he challenged Newton. He challenged Newton on his theory of color, etc. But he found a scientific method which was a way of directly participating in that which you were studying, so that the wholeness of the thing could be found in each part. And so he refused to objectify. He refused to shift into the empirical method that slices and dices and separates. And it's not that that's all bad by any means. You and I agree on that. But Goethe, and he's starting to be recovered, but he had a felt sense of the wholeness of the universe and this intuition that there was an elegant, undivided quality about the universe, that the moment that you extracted yourself from that and started to study a thing as an object with what some have called the arrogant eye of the empirical method, that thing wouldn't actually reveal itself to you. But if you were to suspend the arrogant eye and see the thing in itself on its own terms, and with the assumption of that we're being lived by a wholeness that is also in that which you are contemplating, you can actually know the thing intimately. You can actually, and this is where he challenged, well, Kant hadn't come along yet, but this is where Rudolf Steiner picked up on Goethe's work and challenged Kant's perception that we can't know the world as it is. We can't know the thing in itself. We can only know it as we perceive it. Now, this gets into some deeper philosophical territory, I realize, but I just wonder if there's another way of doing science.
Right. Well, one of the models for thinking about this that I really have picked up on comes from a professor named Jeffrey Carreira, who's at Rice University, and he's also one of the people I interview for this series, and someone whose work influenced my thinking while writing the book. But he talks about cultures, different cultures, as essentially comprising of ranges of possibility. So for instance, if we think about the Enlightenment culture, the modernist culture, the rationality that has been dominant in the West over the last few hundred years, the primacy of a particular way of doing science, as you're saying, Goethe challenged that way of doing science. Goethe felt that there was a more intimate, participatory way of learning about nature rather than a more objectifying, abstracting of data. But it was the more Newtonian abstraction and objectification which won the day and has dominated our thinking. But that culture represents a range of possibilities. And there are things possible in the modern world that were not possible in indigenous world.
Yeah.
But also there are things that were possible in indigenous world that are not possible in the modern world. And I guess I'm really questioning, I think that our idea of evolution as a progressive advancement can be problematic. And I think this framework of different cultures, different historical epochs, representing different ranges of possibility, that doesn't necessarily imply a directionality, might be a valuable one for us to adopt, because it means that, normally if you are very deeply embedded in a modernist point of view, and then you study indigenous peoples and you hear about some of the capacities that people seem to have, where, for instance, they would go into the forest and plants would talk to them and tell them what ailments to use them for.
Right.
And to a modernist, to us that seems ludicrous. It couldn't really happen. We might be able to explain it in some other way, that it was some kind of intuition, but that isn't the way those cultures defined it. And my understanding of Kripal is he's saying, well, actually, in those cultures where they talk about how plants talking to you and giving you information, those capacities actually existed in those cultures.
Absolutely.
It isn't, it wasn't, that's just the way they talked about it. And, now that we're in the modern era and we know how things really work,
right,
we can go back and say, well, that they thought that's what was happening, but it was actually something else. He's saying, no, actually, there's just a different possibility range in those cultures. And just because, in the modern world we've lost those capacities doesn't mean they didn't exist. And I find that, thinking about cultures and historical epics, and, ultimately, in the book I say the foundation of any culture is the sense of self. And so every sense of self, in our case, the thinking thing, defines a range of possibility. There's certain things that are possible for people who are embedded in a thinking thing self, and certain things that are not possible.
Yeah, I really like that way of thinking about it, Jeff. It's really helpful because you and I both know that in the realm of sort of integral philosophy and spiral dynamics, the mantra is transcend and include, but rarely does the include thing or part of that actually happen in terms of bringing forth the actual, in this case, indigenous intelligence to inform or animate a modernist or a postmodernist intelligence. They're not in practice taken on their own terms. And
right.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Would be
and I think you can't go into these traditions, I guess it's the phrase you just said struck me, is they have to be taken on their own terms. So I've recently met a teacher of Lomi Lomi massage, which is an ancient Hawaiian massage and in its own world a spiritual practice. And I was very taken by her and her work. In fact, I interviewed her as part of this series as well. Her name is Jody Mountain. And I just, she had a master of that tradition who she worked with until his death, and she's very in that world. And I'm going to go study with her for a week in a few months. And what I'm aware of is I want to surrender myself into the world of that practice as deeply as I possibly can, and as deeply maybe as is possible in the modern world. Because that practice is now being practiced inside of a larger modern context. Yeah. But I want to see what's possible, because I experienced, working with her, I experienced something that felt miraculous, that I didn't understand, and it won't leave me alone. And I want to be able to surrender myself into a world so that I can experience what are the possibilities in that world, and how is it going to affect the way I relate to myself, to the universe, and yeah, I just think I'm opening up to wisdom from sources that I had for a long time not given much thought to.
And it just makes, as you're describing this, it makes perfect sense to me in terms of your interest and given your experiences too, in terms of practicing this, whatever you want to call it, we space or intersubjective space, and the deeper, higher wisdom that descends when people come together with a certain intention to feel into a new self. That one of the ways in which sources of allurement for us who have that interest would be indigenous cultures, and what wisdom that we we didn't include, but rather kind of left behind in the modern period. You know, there's no question. My experience in these ayahuasca journeys, you know, in terms of whether plants can speak to you, well, plants speak to you. I mean,
right.
It's you know, there's a direct knowing that's coming from the consciousness of this plant that's working its way and opening up your mind. And yeah,
Beautiful.
It doesn't make sense from this more contracted sense of self or from the world of the possibilities of the modern self. You know, it's hard to imagine, but like you say, when you surrender to other possibilities, who knows? You know, it's beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And maybe let's talk a minute about about this intersubjective awakening. Because that is the culminating point of the book. And my essential premise is that the thinking thing self of isolated individuals that has become the foundational sense of self for the modern world has reached, its range of possibilities no longer extends far enough for us to meet the challenges that we face. And so a new self needs to be born. And what I have experienced as the closest, what I've experienced that's convinced me that it is the best candidate I know of for the new self came out of experiences of intersubjective awakening, collective being, and specifically those happened in dialogue practices with groups of individuals, sometimes very dramatically, where under the right conditions, a group of sincere people who are focused and highly engaged in conversation can experience the dissolution of the boundaries that separate us. So suddenly you start to realize that all of the, just like the exercise of, when did you appear in the world? You can do an exercise of, well, what actually separates me from you? And in these dialogue practices, those boundaries start to fall away. And eventually what you realize is that the intelligence that's being expressed by all of the seemingly separate individuals is coming from the same source. I'm speaking to you right now on the phone, and then you're speaking back to me, but what's speaking is not Jeff or Bruce. It would be, you can experience it as, it would be more accurate to say that it's that the voices and what's happening is actually emerging out of the circumstance or out of the space between us. And if you think about it, it actually logically makes sense. We've been speaking now for 40 minutes or so, and I said a lot of things and you've said a lot of things. If you and I hadn't been on this phone call together, let's say I had continued doing what I was doing before and you had continued doing what you were doing before, none of this conversation would have emerged. This conversation wasn't a product of Jeff or a product of Bruce. It was a product of this interaction. It only happened because of this interaction. I'm only saying what I'm saying now because of what's gone on before in the conversation. And you don't even know what you're about to say, but it will emerge out of you in direct response, to the last thing that I say. So we're actually in a surrendered process in which we are allowing our voices and our minds to be orchestrated by the engagement that we're currently involved in.
Yeah, that's beautiful. In the Judeo-Christian lineage, sounds very close to what is talked about as wisdom or Sophia.
Mm-hmm.
This transcendent intelligence that is known in community. And my understanding is that one of the ways that Jesus identified himself, that the early community didn't lay on him, was as a child of wisdom. And so when he says things like, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst," I sometimes wonder if that's, if he's not in a sense describing how when you have a gathering of these kind of committed and engaged people like you have, and I've had some experience of this as well, that in fact wisdom is connecting, is given the opportunity to connect more deeply with itself or herself. And so therefore what emerges is that a whole new dimension of consciousness that transcends any of the individuals that are participating is given the opportunity to arise, and it's this wisdom that lifts everybody up into a new realm.
Right. And I would completely agree that that's the case. And the way that I imagine it is, if I think of consciousness as a field, then the sense of self that is the thinking thing, obviously there's a range of possibility. You can have lower level thinking thing self possibilities, and you have higher thinking thing self possibilities. But the thinking thing can only go so high, and then it can't get any higher. It's like it doesn't have the buoyancy to go any higher in consciousness. But somehow when we let go of those separations, it is experienced as an awakened collective can travel higher in the spheres of consciousness and open up new possibilities. And that's what's so exciting. And I guess what I'm aware of in the book, when I was initially doing collective intelligence work 25 years ago, it wasn't very popular. The group that I was working with was very interested in it, but it wasn't popularly known yet, and I think some of the extraordinary experiences that we had helped popularize it, and so today we-space practices have certainly gained a lot of popularity, at least among certain circles. But what I'm aware of is that we-space practices that do often, I think, give people powerful experiences of collective awakening, if it stays in the domain of we-space practices, it's not enough to transform society because we can't limit it to experiences of a new self. We actually have to construct a new self. We need to construct a new platform for perception, as you've mentioned earlier, so that we can rebuild the world and rebuild our culture from that new platform, so that eventually, new babies that are born are going to be born into that sense of self rather than the thinking thing self. Just like you and I are born into a modernist sense of self. We didn't have to work for it, but that there were individuals throughout the 1200s and the 1300s who were struggling really hard to attain the level of differentiation that you and I were just born into. Yeah. And so we need to establish that foundation, that new sense of self, at this level of collective being, so that it becomes the ground upon which we recreate the world and recreate a new culture.
Yeah. Wow, that's a mighty vision, and it's a question that I've asked myself for a long time, because in a sense, what is the modern equivalent of the village or the tribe? where in some ways this intersubjective space was the only game in town, but how do you, like you say, you can come together for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks and create this, but then, and I know that in your own community, Jeff, like you folks had this in the context of an intentional community. Short of that, though, I mean, how do you stabilize this we space? Because I find myself very isolated, actually. I connect through Skype with some people who want to practice this, but by and large, I'm not surrounded by a whole bunch of people who want to live this and integrate this. So it's a challenge.
It's a real challenge, and I feel that I teach a lot and I write books, and I introduce people to ideas, and I run retreats and give people experiences, and I think all that's really important. But underneath it all, what's most important to me is discovering the new form of community that will work. I mean, as you said, I was part of an intentional community for many years. We had incredible breakthrough experiences, and we also had many challenges, and eventually that community couldn't be sustained. And I'm thankful for what I got from it, but I'm also realizing that some of the structures of that community make it not a viable solution for the world. So I'm really looking to what is the community? How do we connect? Certainly we have these virtual means of connection, and that's part of the solution, but I don't think it's the whole solution. It also has to do with how do we identify with each other? How do we, a community isn't just a place to live, and it's not just a series of phone calls. It's an identity. It is itself a collective identity. And I think discovering new forms of community where people are actually living in an ongoing engagement with each other and in a way in which everyone recognizes and identifies with is crucial. It's so needed right now. In some ways, I feel like it's needed more than anything else because, as you said, you can come together and do practices. But I think for a new sense of self to form, for this collective being to be able to form itself into a new platform for perception, it requires us to be intimately and ongoingly involved with each other and each other's lives in some form that's actually going to work in the modern world.
Yeah, exactly.
It's been really great to have this conversation with you. It as most conversations do, it had a life of its own and went in directions I wouldn't have anticipated. But I really appreciate your speaking with me today and sharing some of your thoughts about the ideas in the book and going with me in directions that took us beyond what I covered in the book.
Well, as somebody who's read it now a couple of times, I want those people who are listening. This is a really important book to read, and thank you, Jeff, for your work and for your leadership.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce, and we'll talk again soon.